As 2025 began, Ukraine's war entered its fourth year, a year marked by a frustrating duality. On one hand, there were renewed diplomatic efforts, with President Trump taking center stage in high-profile negotiations. On the other, the reality on the ground was a brutal battlefield stalemate, where neither side could claim decisive progress. The world watched as hopes for a breakthrough flickered, but the violence and uncertainty only deepened. While world leaders gathered for talks in distant capitals, the front lines in eastern and southern Ukraine remained stubbornly static. Each village gained or lost came at a staggering cost in lives and resources. The fighting was relentless, with soldiers enduring months of shelling, mud, and exhaustion, and civilians caught in the crossfire faced unimaginable hardship. Russian missile and drone strikes battered Ukrainian cities and energy infrastructure, plunging millions into darkness and cold. The attacks tested the nation's resilience, as families huddled in shelters and emergency crews raced to restore power. The psychological toll was immense, with every siren and explosion a reminder of the war's reach. Ukrainian forces adapted to the relentless pressure, shifting their focus to defense and launching daring strikes deep into Russian territory. Special forces and drone units targeted supply lines and command centers, seeking to disrupt the Kremlin's war machine and force Moscow to reconsider its strategy. Russia, meanwhile, pressed on with overwhelming firepower and sheer numbers. Their advances were slow and costly, consolidating some territory, but failing to break Ukraine's resolve. The Kremlin gambled that attrition would eventually tip the balance, but Ukrainian resistance remained fierce. Both sides clung to the belief that time was on their side, fueling a dangerous new phase of attrition. The seasons changed, but the war's rhythm of attack, defense, and loss remained unbroken. The cost was measured not just in territory, but in shattered communities and lives forever altered. The year became a case study in modern conflict, where neither military might nor high-level diplomacy could deliver a breakthrough. Negotiators faced deadlock, and military planners struggled to find a path to victory. The world's most powerful leaders found themselves unable to bridge the gap between battlefield realities and diplomatic ambitions. The central question loomed larger than ever: could the relentless pressure of war force compromise at the negotiating table, or would both sides remain locked in a cycle of escalation and disappointment? As 2026 dawns, the answer is clear: peace remained elusive. The story of 2025 is not just about failed talks or shifting front lines, but about the human cost of a conflict with no end in sight. For millions, daily life meant adapting to loss, uncertainty, and the hope that tomorrow might bring relief. The world watched, hoping for resolution, but found only more uncertainty. International institutions debated, citizens rallied in solidarity, and the headlines told a story of endurance and frustration. The war's fourth year ended as it began, with hope and heartbreak in equal measure, and the question of peace still unanswered. Donald Trump's inauguration in January 2025 marked a dramatic shift in the international approach to the war. The world watched as a new administration took the reins, promising to upend the status quo and bring a fresh perspective to a conflict that had dragged on for years. Trump promised a quick end, placing himself at the center of negotiations with Putin and Zelensky, favoring direct, leader-to-leader engagement over multilateral talks. He dismissed traditional diplomatic channels, insisting that only bold, personal intervention could break the deadlock. His strategy relied on personal relationships and bold rhetoric, aiming to force both sides to the table. Trump's approach was unapologetically unconventional, betting that his reputation as a deal-maker would translate into diplomatic success on the world stage. Critics warned that personality-driven diplomacy couldn't resolve deep issues like sovereignty and security, and feared Trump might pressure Ukraine into concessions. Many experts questioned whether bypassing allies in established processes would undermine long-term stability or embolden adversaries. Despite skepticism, the administration pressed forward, setting the stage for a year of high-stakes, high-risk diplomacy. Behind closed doors, American officials scrambled to coordinate new strategies while allies watched with a mix of hope and apprehension. The world watched to see if Trump's unconventional approach would deliver peace or deepen the divide. Every move was scrutinized, every statement analyzed, as the fate of Ukraine and the balance of global power hung in the balance. The stakes for Ukraine, and for America's global role, had never been higher. The coming months would test not only Trump's strategy, but the resilience of international alliances and the hopes of millions longing for an end to war. Early diplomatic momentum quickly collided with reality, as optimism from initial talks faded into the background of hard geopolitical truths. The world watched as hopes for a breakthrough were tested by the weight of history and the stubbornness of national interests. In February, a tense White House meeting ended with Zelensky walking out after Trump bluntly told him Ukraine had little leverage. The encounter, marked by sharp words and visible frustration, set the tone for months of strained communication between the two leaders. The fallout strained U.S.-Ukraine relations and pushed Trump closer to seeking a deal with Putin. Behind closed doors, American officials scrambled to contain the damage, while Ukrainian diplomats worried about being sidelined. But Trump's direct engagement with Putin, including a much-hyped Alaska summit, failed to yield results. Planned meetings were canceled, and frustration grew. The world's cameras captured the empty stages, and the disappointed faces of diplomats, leaving yet another fruitless round of talks. By summer, Trump's tone soured. He publicly blamed Putin for stalling peace, admitting his efforts were not working. The media seized on his rare admission of failure, and headlines around the globe questioned whether diplomacy had reached a dead end. The diplomatic track seemed doomed, but by year's end, a thaw emerged. Zelensky visited Mar-a-Lago, and Trump claimed progress after a lengthy call with Putin. The mood shifted, if only slightly, as both sides hinted at new possibilities. U.S. and Ukrainian officials began working on a revised peace framework. Negotiators pored over documents late into the night, searching for common ground and hoping to salvage what remained of the diplomatic process. The process was rocky, marked by heated exchanges and moments of doubt, but diplomacy, though fragile, was not dead. Each side weighed concessions and risks, aware that the stakes could not be higher. The year's summits revealed the limits of personal diplomacy in the face of entrenched interests. Even the most powerful leaders found themselves constrained by forces beyond their control, as old rivalries and new suspicions resurfaced. The world saw that even bold leaders could not easily bend the war to their will. The spectacle of summits and statements gave way to the sobering reality of a conflict with no easy answers. The search for peace continued, but the path was as uncertain as ever. As the year closed, the world was left wondering whether the next round of talks would bring hope, or simply more disappointment. On the ground, 2025 was a year of attrition, not breakthroughs. Both sides dug in, creating fortified lines and fighting for every meter with drones, artillery, and infantry assaults. The front barely moved, but casualties mounted relentlessly. Ukraine shifted to active defense, using Western weapons and local knowledge to blunt Russian attacks and launch limited counterstrikes. Russia relied on massed artillery and human wave tactics, gaining ground village by village but failing to achieve decisive breakthroughs. The war became a contest of endurance, with each side hoping to exhaust the other. The cost in lives and resources was staggering, and the stalemate shaped every strategic decision. Ukraine's strategy in 2025 was twofold: hold the line and disrupt Russia's war effort. On defense, Ukrainian forces excelled at repelling Russian assaults, turning the front into a costly quagmire for Moscow. Simultaneously, Ukraine escalated long-range strikes deep into Russian territory, targeting oil refineries, depots, and military bases. These attacks disrupted Russia's logistics and showcased Ukraine's growing technological edge. The strikes forced Russia to divert resources and complicated its planning, sending a clear message: nowhere was safe. While these tactics imposed real costs, they did not break the stalemate. Ukraine's endurance and adaptability kept hope alive, but the war's fundamental dynamics remained unchanged. The strategy was one of survival, waiting for pressure to force Russia to the table. Russia's approach was relentless attrition, using massed artillery and waves of troops to grind forward, especially in the Donbass. Factories ran non-stop, fueling a war machine that prioritized firepower over speed. Human wave attacks led to horrific casualties, but allowed Russia to claim incremental gains. Simultaneously, Russia targeted Ukraine's energy grid with missiles and drones, aiming to break civilian morale and cripple the economy. Despite heavy losses, the Kremlin believed time and resources were on its side. The slow, costly advance was celebrated as progress, but the strategic map barely changed. Russia gambled that Ukraine's defenses, and Western support, would eventually falter. By year's end, the core demands of both sides remained irreconcilable. Ukraine insisted on robust Western security guarantees and restoration of its full territory, including Crimea and the Donbass. Zelensky rejected any deal that rewarded Russian aggression, though some flexibility was discussed for disputed regions. Russia demanded international recognition of its annexed territories and a neutral, non-NATO Ukraine. Moscow refused to accept limits on its military or relinquish gains. The US and Ukraine drafted a 20-point peace framework, but Russia held firm to its maximalist terms. The chasm between the sides was too wide for compromise. Each saw concessions as a defeat worse than continued war. The 2025's diplomatic dance failed for one reason: neither side felt enough pain to compromise. The battlefield stalemate hardened positions. Each believed endurance would yield victory, or at least prevent defeat. Russia's economy adapted to war, and slow gains fueled domestic propaganda. Ukraine, battered but unbroken, refused to cede territory after years of sacrifice. Western aid kept Ukraine fighting, while Russia bet on outlasting both Kyiv and its allies. No leader was willing to accept the cost of peace on the other's terms. Diplomacy, even with Trump's intervention, could not overcome the hard logic of war. The year ended with two exhausted nations, neither ready to surrender. As 2026 begins, Ukraine's war stands at a crossroads. Stalemate on the battlefield, and diplomacy stalled. Russia grinds forward, Ukraine holds firm, and Western support remains crucial. The key question: who can endure longer, Russia's war machine or Ukraine's alliance-backed resistance? The 20-point peace framework remains on the table, but core issues, territory and security, are unresolved. Trump's renewed engagement could shape the next phase, but a breakthrough requires a shift in either side's calculus. The war's future will be decided by battlefield developments, sustained support, and leaders' willingness to compromise. For Ukrainians, hope for peace endures, but as of now, it remains a distant dream. The world waits, uncertain, as the conflict grinds on into another year.